Okay. All right. Looks like it's quieted down, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Andrea Watts. I am the manager of the SAF Northwest office, which provides support services for the Alaska, Oregon, and Washington state societies on that. So for today's session is Nate Anderson is going to give a presentation. Just a little brief bio here. He is a research forester with the Rocky Mountain Research Station based out of Missoula, Montana. Where he studies forest resources management and economics. And he's been with the station since 2009. And today his presentation is on opportunities for landscape restoration, markets, wood products, and biomass. So Nate, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Thanks a lot, Andrea. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And thank you all for joining this breakout session. Andrea, just let me know if anything is going wrong. Otherwise, I'll just assume it's all going right.
Okay, yep, it's good. You're coming through clear.
Okay.
You're coming through clear. So.
Great, thank you. So yeah, this is a breakout session devoted to markets, wood products, and biomass utilization, specifically related to landscape restoration. And if you're here in this session, you probably know this is not an easy topic. I'm gonna talk for about a half an hour. I'm gonna start a stopwatch right now so I don't go over, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion and comments afterwards. I'm going to talk a lot about some of the things that we've heard a lot about the last couple of days regarding restoration, but I'm going to come at it from a little bit different angle, downstream derived demand, market-based kind of economic aspects of restoration, and then look at some opportunities. So I will start out by talking about the challenges and benefits of restoration, but very briefly, because I know we've talked a lot about that the last couple of days. But I do want to talk about non-market benefits of restoration, and then de-risking investment in forest restoration, but also investment in forest enterprise. And so this is for-profit businesses, entrepreneurs, enterprises that are a huge part of forest restoration if we're thinking about increasing the pace and scale of restoration tied to markets for removals. Then I want to talk about some recent policy initiatives, and I'll do that in the context of a bigger picture review of policy instruments that we can use to help get wood and biomass flowing in this restoration context, have a few conclusions. And then at 1:30, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So let's move right into it. So I want to thank, before I get into the nitty gritty, just to thank my co-author, Robert Campbell, who is a postdoc of mine at the University of Montana, but now is at Northwestern Energy, and then the funding agencies for some of the work I'll share with you today. And I definitely want to thank university partners over the years, including Oregon State University. We've had a lot of good collaborations with faculty and students and postdocs and technicians. And a lot of this work that kind of cuts across government and industry and academia relies pretty heavily on state NGO and industry partners. So thanks to everybody who's contributed to what I'll share with you today. So I won't belabor these points. We've heard a lot about them over the last couple of days, but when we were talking about forest restoration, a lot of times, especially in our part of the world, we're talking about restoring a fire resilient condition, restoring drought resilience under climate change. Often this means more heterogeneity on the landscape at different scales, stand, forest, landscape levels. We're talking a lot about restoring burned areas, and I'll talk more about that when I get to the policy segment of this presentation. And the big picture here is protecting ecosystem function from disturbance and degradation. So that's soil and watershed function, obviously, but as forest managers, as forest owners, as different people involved in this forest restoration effort, we're trying to protect and deliver ecosystem services. And I'll talk a lot about that in a moment, and how we value those ecosystem services, or how we don't value them in certain contexts. So we know forest restoration also has big operational challenges. So when we're thinking about implementing a lot of the good silviculture that we have on paper, the implementation can be difficult. We have complex residual stand conditions. Often on the downstream side of the equation, this translates to higher costs, higher operational costs, lower product values. Depending on where you are, you may have restricted or limited markets for some of these products, especially biomass and low-grade roundwood. This translates to narrower profit margins, higher costs, lower values. That's a tough environment. And one thing I want to point out is that often it's pretty complex for us to value these treatments when we consider all the possible values. So the problem here is that many of the values that we expect from our forests, and many of the values that are protected and potentially restored from forest restoration, are not expressed in market prices. And so there's an extensive literature in the economics literature and in finance and other disciplines focused on this issue. How do we value these non-market ecosystem goods and services? And I think they're appreciated at a high level, at a management level, at a planning level, but they're not very often explicitly integrated into project scale planning or the financial analysis of different treatments or the optimization of treatment schedules. And so we may be looking at values at risk, but not as specifically as we do with market values. And so one of the solutions to this is to start to develop methods to integrate these non-market values into project scale cost benefit analysis. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to share a little bit of work we've done on that before we talk about policy. So when we think of non-market benefits, we can actually quantify the public's willingness to pay for certain non-market benefits. So what we can think about when we do these treatments, the ability to reduce wildfire risk, to improve air quality, to have healthier forests, and generate renewable energy in some contexts. And so these are four that we have highlighted in some of our research that the public, I think, has a pretty good appreciation for. Certainly wildfire risk is on their mind, air quality, and thinking about differences between big smoke months in the midsummer versus inconvenient smoke on either end associated with prescribed burning. The forest health issues, the public, we have demonstrated that they have a willingness to pay for better forest health and renewable energy. So we can think of renewable energy as something that we have demonstrated that the public understands and has a positive willingness to pay for. And there are a lot of other ecosystem services and things that we could include here. Rural development is a huge objective of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and things like that. But I'm going to focus for the brief research segment here just on these four: wildfire risk, air quality, healthier forest, and renewable energy. So one of the ways that we can value non-market benefits is by conducting choice modeling experiments. And this is not the time or place to go through the detailed methodology for how we go about this. But this type of approach can really help inform cost-benefit trade-offs associated with forest restoration, scenario planning, treatment optimization. And the big picture here is efficient public policy. So developing incentives that help us get more of what we want and less of what we don't want. And so public policy can really help us do that in an economic context. So I'm going to give me 1 second here. I'm going to step out of my full screen mode here. Oops. I skipped over this slide and I want to talk about this. So when we think of our forests and what we kind of demand from our forests, I want to make the point that often what we see is the removals, right? We see timber, we see fiber, we see fuel wood leaving the woods. Those have market values associated with them, and they go into commercial supply chains. And so we often can focus on those. They're very easy to focus on. But as all of us on this call know, there's a lot more going on and a lot more flowing from our forests. So we can think of supporting services like the core ecosystem support that we have with nutrient cycling, primary production, soil formation, habitat, wildlife, biodiversity, those sorts of things. And also these regulating services. So thinking of carbon sequestration, climate regulation, purification of air and water, flood protection, and these other things. And certainly among the cultural services that we expect from our forest, recreation is another one of those that's very obvious to us, right? We can see it happening. We can collect money in the form of user fees. And so often we're getting all of these things from our forests, but we don't necessarily have market values associated with the supply chains from the removals. And often we're looking for these revenues from these things in bold type here to pay for the whole meal deal when we actually have these other things. So back to the quantifying these non-market benefits. We conducted a study to look at fuel treatments and how we might incorporate these non-market values from choice modeling experience with the public. And an interesting thing happens when you incorporate non-market values. And we just looked at these 4. There are 2 different things going on here. One is whether we use the biomass for energy or not. And one is whether we take the biomass generated by fuel treatments and forest restoration, and we actually incorporate the non-market values in that treatment. So the top left here is a histogram here of all the possible outcomes in a simulation of what it might cost to build a $38 million to treat 6,900 acres a year. And if we treat 6,900 acres a year for 20 years, that's going to be a huge cost. So the top left is just if we're going to cut that and pile burn it, no utilization and no non-market values. It's just the pure market values. If we actually get that material to a bioenergy facility, in this case, an 11 megawatt power plant, we can power over 10,000 homes. We can treat that same amount of acreage per year, and we can use about 77,000 dry tons a year to power this power plant. And it's still negative. So we go from negative $275 million to negative $178 million, but we have this bioenergy market value. If we go to the bottom left, we're thinking about quantifying those 4 non-market values and pile burning, but the treatments now we account for those non-market values. People's willingness to pay for reduced wildfire risk, improved air quality, healthier forests. And this is obviously better than not including those non-market values. So we have an improvement here. The bottom left, the bottom right is where we're including both the bioenergy market value and those non-market values. So this starts to look a lot better than just the big net cost associated with doing the treatments, piling the material, and burning it, which is that negative $275 million scenario. So if we get it to a bioenergy plant and we can account for the non-market values, this starts to look pretty good. And in these figures that I'm showing you here, there's no timber value included. So just one more slide associated with the research component here is we're thinking about shifting that curve to the left, and we end up in this situation where we're accounting for bioenergy, use of the biomass, and these other things. Now the timber really has to generate maybe $172 an acre. Maybe that's in the realm of possibility. We might be able to get value for the heat off that biomass plant. Maybe we have some sort of incentive on the power purchase side for renewable energy that helps us shift that to a more positive revenue generating situation. So, and this doesn't even include things like suppression costs, savings in the future, or any sort of greenhouse gas climate benefits. Those are direct benefits that we might be able to include that aren't included here. So we can shift it from a net cost scenario on the left to the net positive on the right. And so this is work you can go look at or contact me if you want more information. But the main point is here we're trying to de-risk investment in forest restoration. So this is one way to conceptualize that. Risk has two components when in this context. One is we can de-risk something by increasing the financial returns on investment. If we're talking about a for-profit enterprise or we're just accounting for all those values, we want to increase the financial returns on investment and reduce the risk of investment. So risk can come from uncertainty. It can come from stochastic factors that we don't anticipate or that have a random aspect to them, like some market transactions, unexpected changes, or impacts that are rare, that have a low probability of occurring, but have a really severe impact on our project. So we can think about this as one way on the forest restoration side. If we know where our material is going for an extended period of time, because we have a supply contract, that reduces the risk of investment in terms of unexpected things in the market. And then we might be able to get carbon and climate value for a project to get a better return on investment. So we move this restoration project from the bottom right, which is high risk, low return, to the top left, which is lower risk, higher return. And so as foresters, we're often obsessed with these pictures here, right? The woods and what we're doing in the woods. But we also want to be thinking about de-risking investment in the broader bioeconomy. So I get it. We need to spray paint. We need to get out there. We need to do these treatments. And as you know, as a research forester, I'm trying to think about how to help as many people as possible broaden their perspective of de-risking this restoration equation to include the whole bioeconomy from the stump to the end use. And we can think about this at different scales, big power plants, big sawmills, or maybe a constellation of different enterprises and different entrepreneurial activities that cut across those different scales from large to small. So when we're thinking about de-risking investment in the bioeconomy that would then act as a pull into somebody's not muted. So when we're thinking about de-risking the whole bioeconomy, this picture looks the same, the figure looks the same, but it's a little bit different. So we're thinking about, we have a project, is it or is it not feasible? Again, we want to be thinking about de-risking this project, and we can move things from high risk to lower risk, from lower financial return to higher financial return. And so for a particular project, having an agreement that covers risk associated with the supply of our raw materials is a good thing, and having the agreement where we have a market to sell our products and an offtake agreement, that's a good thing risk-wise. And then we can go back to some of these non-market values like carbon and climate to potentially increase the financial return. And one of my main points here is that we want to be thinking about forest management and forest restoration as a component of this big bioeconomy, and think about derived demand and downstream, and a focus on bioproduct supply chains, not just biomass or log supply chains. So I'm going to transition here to talk about public policy, and I have little time to do this, and I think this will hopefully get our juices flowing in terms of thinking about what's coming down the pipe for opportunities associated with forest restoration. A few more academic points, and then I'll share with you some actual policy initiatives. But when we think about a private enterprise delivering public benefits that are uncompensated, that's a market failure. So the price that's paid in the market does not include all the costs and benefits, so it's an incomplete valuation. And for situations where we have private enterprises delivering products that are that generate these positive benefits that aren't in the price, we're going to buy less of them. And sometimes there's products out there, like products made from fossil fuels, in which the negative external or externalities associated with them are not included in the price. We're going to buy more of those than we would if we incorporated the negative aspects of those in the price under this market failure. So we're thinking about restoration and downstream products. They may actually be undervalued and underproduced. We may get less restoration than we normally would if we don't incorporate some of these things into our thinking and our pricing and things like that. So we want to incentivize positive externalities and public benefits. And I want to make a particular point about something like a subsidy, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But subsidy is a bad word, right? We don't want to pick winners and losers. We don't want to subsidize an industry. If the starting point is market equilibrium and a free market that's functioning properly, that there are arguments where subsidies cause problems, right? But what I'm talking about here is something different. We're talking about these supply chains generating public benefits that we want more of, and they're not included in the pricing. So we want to rectify that situation. And there's a few different ways we can do it. We can think about direct incentives. I mentioned subsidies, but we can talk about premiums, tax credits, carbon offsets, renewable identification numbers, which I'll talk about in a minute. Grants, loan guarantees, low interest loans, CapEx to try to get investment in these projects, public-private co-investment, partnerships. We've talked a lot about it the last couple of days. Feed-in tariffs, which is just a technical term for an offtake agreement for something like electricity or heat and power. Long-term contracts, supply and offtake agreements. These all help de-risk these supply chains that we're hoping will facilitate restoration. There are some other more academic and more kind of up and coming sexy things on the horizon, but I'll leave you with those. I also want to highlight a couple things. One is that in this environment, research, development, and especially extension is hugely important in terms of helping people understand risk, look at risk, evaluate the different types of opportunities that are out there. And I think this has a huge role to play in terms of incentivizing public benefits. The other point I want to make on this slide is that we're focused a lot on forest policy, but we can use other sectors and other types of policies to drive change in the forest sector. So certainly energy policy and how we go about renewable energy can make an impact. Water policy and how we protect municipal watersheds that are hugely valuable, but that's not always translated into the price of what we are doing on the ground to protect these watersheds. Agricultural policy in terms of what goes in the soil, things like biochar from wood off forest restoration, things like that. Economic growth, local jobs, climate policy, biodiversity and wildlife, all of these things have policy associated with them. So we don't necessarily have to stay in the green circle. We can range across sectors and still develop policies that help incentivize forest restoration on the ground. So here's an example going back to that analysis. This is a different paper where we're looking at a production system that produces both liquid fuel and also a biochar co-product. Many of you are probably familiar with biochar, but it's a carbon charcoal product that can be used as a soil amendment. And when we look at this particular operation, and you can look at this paper for details, we're thinking about no policy instrument in play, just pure market economics. And we're going to lose $24 million over the 20 years of this project. That's a pretty big loss, not a great project. Everything, incidentally, I forgot to explain this on the others, everything to the left is a negative outcome and everything to the right is a positive outcome, and the net present value there is the average over all of those. But if we incorporate a renewable identification credit or RINs credit for this liquid fuel, this becomes a viable project. And so I think that's a good example, and you can go look up that example in the literature. But with the time I have left before we get into discussion, I just want to talk a little bit about some policy that's kind of baking up here at the national level. Many of you on this call are already know much more about Oregon-specific public policy, and I hope you can comment on that during the discussion. But just a few things I want to share with you. If you're familiar with during the transition into the Biden administration, this memo came out, the Climate 21 Project Transition Memo, and they had some recommendations for the USDA in here. They had recommendations for a bunch of different departments, but the ones for USDA, this stuff should speak to you loudly, no matter what part of the forest sector you're in. We're talking about private forest owners, helping them reduce greenhouse gas emissions by sequestering carbon in their forests and reducing emissions from their forests. We're talking about rural energy, private working lands and public forests together at that landscape, scale, and how do we bolster the resilience of those forests to climate change coming down the pipe. Sustainable bioenergy, wood products, bio-based materials. These were all part of this transition memo when it comes to climate, and investing in rural communities for economic development. So you'll see similar themes come out of the Biden administration's executive orders. I could have picked a few different ones. There's a lot in there, but this is one that's focused on tackling the climate crisis, 14008. And you'll see a lot of these same themes in terms of policy development here at the national level. So reforestation, resilience to wildfire and disturbance. This one is targeting federal land specifically, but at the landscape scale, shared stewardship context as well. We're thinking about private landowners, supporting them in sequestering carbon in their forests, in their soils, in their biomass, and in wood products. Sustainable bioproducts and fuels from biomass. Well-paying jobs, rural America. As I mentioned, this is a huge objective of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is economic development in rural America. And one thing that stands out here is market-based mechanisms. You notice I did not, previously when I was talking about policy levers we could pull, talk a lot about regulation. A lot of those are just pure market-based mechanisms that we can help facilitate try to solve some of this problem that we have with the values we expect from our forests aren't really reflected in some of the pricing and the supply chains of the products that we produce. So how can we incorporate that at the forest level and then along the supply chain through these market-based mechanisms? And then clean energy transition and transition to biomass in places where it's appropriate. So Forest Service strategies. What's the Forest Service looking at in response to this? So we're going from big picture down to more and more granular. Increase the carbon sink strength of forests, both public and private, both above ground in biomass and below ground by protecting soils and enhancing soil carbon. So we can do that as foresters through active management and different types of management on the ground. Reduce emissions from wildfire and disturbance. We've talked a lot about that over the last couple of days. Use climate adapted and disturbance resistant species. And reforesting burned areas. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but especially trying to avoid transition from a high carbon storage state to a low carbon storage state. So we know certain non-forest ecosystems store a lot of carbon below ground. What I'm talking about here is when we burn up a forest and the carbon is released into the atmosphere and there's not that much carbon in the soils and we're left with a non-forest state following disturbance that doesn't regenerate and also doesn't have much carbon stored on the landscape. So, and then increase carbon storage in forest products. So we're looking at traditional forest products, solid wood products, fiber-based products, but then also, developing new products that could especially use biomass, low-grade materials, lignins that are left over from different manufacturing processes, and then promoting the substitution of these products in the marketplace for their high carbon alternatives. So that substitution is an important part of supporting the bioeconomy. And then expanding our idea of forests to include urban and private forests. And we've already done this. So just a couple of specific examples. This has been a pretty high level stuff, but I think we're starting to get more and more motion in terms of how the levers might be pulled And I'm excited to hear from all of you on what you see as opportunities. But here's a few things you might have heard. The Trillion Trees Act, looking to establish requirements and incentives to plant trees and conduct other land management activities associated with carbon storage in the forest ecosystem and harvested wood products. This is where planting trees, a lot of places in the West, we want fewer trees, right? We're trying to solve, we have too many trees when we look at overstock stands that are subject to severe wildfire. But a big part of this Trillion Tree Initiative is to reforest areas that have been burned over. So we can think about that. Here's another one that's coming up, biochar demonstration. So biochar, again, is that carbon that can be used in the soil to store carbon in soils and improve soil conditions. And so Tom Miles of the U.S. Biochar Initiative tells me this is the first time biochar has actually shown up in federal legislation in a long time. So it's good to see that kind of stuff. And this might be tied into downstream uses, right? If we think of NRCS 808, that interim standard for soil carbon amendment, we can get wood-based biochars from forest biomass in the soil, and NRCS can incentivize farmers to do that. We start to connect the dots across these supply chains. And so, the more granular we get, the more closer to reality this stuff becomes. And I think so it's going to be really exciting to see how things play out over the next few years. So I'll wrap things up and just, we all know the need for restoration is huge. We know the challenges, especially from an operations and logistics and market-based for-profit standpoint, are pretty severe. But there's some emerging opportunities in policy. It's exciting to see that. And I think the big idea here is to incentivize, not just in the forest sector, but in all these different sectors that can impact the forest sector, to try to incentivize the downstream use of biomass and low value roundwood, and try to be able to have more of that material go to market and less of it burned in place, and help offset the treatment costs so we can reach this goal of at scale and pace. And so as we go into the discussion phase now, I just want to throw a few questions out there to respond to. I'm happy to answer any technical questions or any other questions you have about my presentation, but really the next half an hour, I'm excited more so to hear what's going on in your world, and especially like what opportunities you think should be on our radar right now. What are you seeing out there? What about not in the near term, but a few years out? What do you see as opportunities? And then as this stuff evolves at the federal, state, local, regional level, what do you have shovel ready that might be able to capitalize on an opportunity if it comes up? So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and contact me if you have any questions. I know I went through some of that research stuff pretty quick, but I wanted to get to this session. So I'll stop sharing. Happy to hear from all of you, and I'll hand it over to Andrea.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Nate. Good presentation. So like I said, I think we're a small enough group that I think if people are would like to ask a question, feel free to turn on your unmute and turn on your camera and ask. Otherwise, if you'd rather share it through the chat, I will then read it out loud for Nate. Or if you want to raise your hand, we can call on you. So I think Nate, we'll just start off. So one of the questions you did end with was the opportunities. So does anyone have any opportunities to share, or what should the Forest Service be aware of? Thanks.
Nate, I don't necessarily know if this is an opportunity, but I kind of had a question. So thinking about the use of residual materials off of federal lands, I know that there's an issue with mixing those materials with, say, residual materials off of private lands. So say for use in like a biomass plant or creating biochar or something like that. And then there's also the challenge of federal material, state material cannot be exported as well. How do you see that changing moving forward? And what are some opportunities there, I guess, for ameliorating some of those challenges?
Yeah, I think good question, and it's one that I think people are thinking about and working on, and it's not my expertise in terms of the export rule, so I'll give that less attention. But in terms of the need to differentiate between national forest materials and private land or state land materials, and maintaining a good chain of custody, has to do with the purpose of doing that, right? And one of the reasons why that's been a big issue is because people view those materials, fundamentally different. And often it's kind of a schizophrenic situation where you're like, oh, wait, okay, biomass from national forest is good, but private land is bad, so we need to keep them separate. And then a little while later, depending on the policy, the opposite is true, and we need to, keep them separate for a different reason that seems to be the opposite of the reason we kept them separate last time. And so I think especially with bioenergy stuff, with the idea that we may get in a situation where we're woods vacuuming and every stick and every leaf and every twig is coming out of the woods for some purpose. I think those of us who work in the woods and see the leakage on the supply chain from the stump to the landing and then beyond that, a lot of material stays behind. And so as far as differentiating materials, I think it's a bigger picture of anytime we're talking about incentivizing work on the ground, we need good chain of custody, period, to know where the materials came from. And this applies in the tropical rainforest when we're talking about making guitars out of rare hardwoods. Where'd that material come from? If you don't know, you are running the risk that it came from some place that's not achieving your goal, right? So I would say that I don't see a good chain of custody going away, but I think what may start to change is the methods by which we track that stuff, especially on low value products, changing, right? I hesitate to even throw this term out there, but thinking about like blockchains as ways to have unique records of existence of something that's traveling across the supply chain from the woods in Oregon all the way to an end use in Finland or halfway around the world. I think the technologies for being able to do that will change. I think the reasons for maintaining a good chain of custody and understanding where products are coming from on the ground, I think hopefully the cost of doing that will come down, which will make it more viable. But I don't see the policy need going away anytime soon, especially if it's tied to carbon and ecosystem carbon. If we're generating removals that we're saying have a positive carbon benefit, we better be able to say where those products came from. And so that's a little bit different than I think what you were getting at, which is, this federal wood and federal biomass is different than private wood and private biomass. But at its core is being able to say where the wood came from or where the biomass came from. And then as far as export rule, I know there's some motion on that. I haven't kept up with it. The idea is that if we can't use chips or cants or logs in this country from national forests, why can't we export them to Korea or Japan or other places? That issue has historically been tied up in local jobs, local economic development, and the export of resources. Obviously, that doesn't apply to log exports from private land, so it's a federal land issue.
Okay, all right, great question, Jake. So Nate, in your experience, kind of what regions or what areas are poised to take advantage of this bioeconomy, or what maybe existing infrastructure do they already have to be able to make the switch or add it into their energy portfolio?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from an economics, I'll give you a little bit of a wonky answer, and then also an answer that's more, I guess, tied to personal experiences. I think there's this term in economics that's economies of agglomeration, right? Where you want to be distant from your competitors, but not too distant, because your competitors, everybody's going to locate in a place where there's a good raw material supply, there's good pricing on raw materials, but there's also all these other things that come along with clusters of businesses in a certain sector. So when you see businesses interacting with one another, where one business's waste stream is another business's raw material, that's ideal. So I think one of the things that's good for success is if we can build new businesses in the bioeconomy around existing businesses that are kind of like anchor businesses, right? If you think of a large sawmill, for example, having potentially heat and power on site, or getting them heat and power from biomass on site, if we can incentivize that if they don't have it. They're processing residue streams. If they lose their market for chips or sawdust or something like that, how can we plug that into another industry? And so a few things, I think places that have state policies that incentivize bioeconomy, places that either have or can develop a workforce that meets the needs of these industries, places that have potentially favorable tax status or something like that, but also this industrial ecology is really good. So that's, I think, the economic version of that. How can we have this be, these bio campuses and stuff like that around a nucleus of anchor business, so to speak. The other thing, though, is that a lot of the small scale stuff that people kind of turn their nose up at that as being too small, especially in our industry, where some places we have massive facilities. Think of Lewiston, Idaho, right? How many big facilities are right there in that small footprint? A lot of small rural communities, a relatively small enterprise with, say, 10 employees at industrial wages, exporting materials into markets that are domestic or abroad, that's a big deal for rural communities. So I definitely do not turn my nose up at any sort of investment in this sector at smaller scales. I think one of the big things is de-risking those investments. And so one of the things that academics and extension foresters and people like that can do is help people understand the risks. What are the risks to capital? What are the labor force requirements? What are the different infrastructure requirements and things like that? So each facility is going to be different in terms of their needs, but that's, a couple of things anyway.
Okay, thank you. All right. So George Ice shared, I appreciate your presentation and the challenges we face in restoring forests. Early in this meeting, we have heard the need to not have green and growing everywhere, but to thin and maintain, create opening for fire and drought issues. How do we balance the trillion tree approach with the 21st century climate needs?
Yeah, perfect. I told a colleague once, we don't store carbon by planting trees. We store carbon by killing trees. And what I meant by that was, our problem is obviously that many of you on this call understand in fire-prone ecosystems, is that we're trying to take these overstocked stands that are in poor condition and get them in a fire-resilient condition, and that often means lower stocking, not higher stocking. So I think the Trillion Tree Initiative in particular, how it applies to these types of ecosystems, one important thing is making sure, and I didn't have the pictures in this presentation, but we've seen other places like this and other presentations where you have a fire in a situation where the site and the soils can support a forest, but for whatever reason, post-fire, that site is not regenerating. It's going into a non-forest state. And it's not one of these non-forest states like it's prairie grassland where it has massive carbon stores in the soils. It's a state where the soils are very devoid of organic matter content. We cannot be thinking in those situations that the soil is a big carbon sink. So in the Trillion Trees lens, where we're wait a minute, you want us to now go out and plant trees in these stands? We're actually thinking of, where does it make sense to increase stocking, or where does it make sense to make sure we don't have regeneration failure following some disturbance, and maybe some other disturbance besides a fire? And I think if you start thinking about that way, it starts to make a little more sense, because I think a lot of people had the same gut instinct. It's like, wait, what? This is not our problem. We have different problems in these fire-prone ecosystems. So that's one idea. The other is foresters providing expertise to places where it actually does need to transition in a more traditional reforestation, afforestation standpoint. So I know one of the things in the USDA initiatives is to provide expertise to places where they actually do have legitimate reforestation needs in the country, and make sure that's getting done. And it may not be on commercial timberland. We know a lot of those lands are tended very well in terms of regeneration success. So.
Okay, great. All right. And Mike B., you had a question? Thanks. Go ahead.
Nate, thanks for your presentation. I'll try to limit my question, but I worked as a district forester in the Klamath BLM for years and years. And so from about 2004, 2005 to 2012, I worked with 3 different biomass investors for a biomass plant in Lakeview. And you were talking about scale. Well, Lakeview, Oregon is a small 5,000 population. Well, anyway, all 3 didn't invest. First, they wanted a 20 megawatt plant, then a 30, then a 40, but none of them pulled the trigger. And then another biomass plant was proposed in Klamath Falls, bigger population, more central. Again, none of them pulled the trigger. So then I was back in Washington, D.C. for 5 years and worked with, saw a defense proposal for 3 biochar or biofuel plants in the United States. One in Oregon, one in Southwest United States, and one in the Southeast. So presently, up to date, there's a biofuel plant being built, halfway built in Lakeview, and subsidized, I think, partly by the Defense Department. Well, they just came out after $300 million investment. Guess what? They ran out of money. So I like your idea of incentivizing, but it just doesn't seem to work out to include the non-marketable things. But those are real life examples of biomass in the Southwest or in South Central Oregon in the last 15 years. It doesn't ever seem to pencil out to the market, the private. So can you address that? Even a project like biofuels subsidized by the Defense Department isn't working out.
Yeah. And so that's not an uncommon story, Mike. I appreciate your comments, and I think we need a serious dose of reality sometimes with how we can make, especially big projects, what they call high capex projects, work. So $300 million is a lot of capital to burn through. And so a couple comments. One is your first examples with bio, it sounded like power plants, right? Was that correct, Mike? Power plants, not combined heat and power at a forest industry facility?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So power plants, power plants for biomass, they have to, the price of power and the offtake agreement has to be there. If it's not there, it doesn't work. It does not pencil out. Think about competing with natural gas or coal, or in Idaho, or thinking of even in southern Idaho competing with nuclear power that's already established. Now, part of that is the price is so low because the negative externalities of those fossil fuels are not incorporated in their prices, right? But put that aside for a minute. You're right. These types of facilities will not work without a price for power that reflects the kind of the green renewable nature of the power itself, but then also what's going on the landscape. So I think that needs to be incorporated. And one of the things that's really challenging with utility markets, as we saw in Texas, is they are not, there's a lot going on. They're kind of in many states. The regulations around this are quite different than how do I say it? The regulations around the utility sector seem to vary pretty widely from state to state, where you can have certain states like California strongly incentivize biomass power in some places, to the point where other companies want to wheel it, into California. And then other places don't want anything to do with anything other than the lowest possible price for electricity. And so that's part of your answer there, I think. And then with biofuels, the biofuels markets were pretty hot for a long time. I worked with a company on a project that is similar to the one you described, where back when gasoline was $4 a gallon at the pump, $3.50 at the gallon at the pump, a lot of these plants penciled out. But then gasoline prices dropped to $2.50, and I mean they penciled out with RINs credits included, right? And then gasoline dropped to $2.50 a gallon and stayed there for 10 years. And so if you did your calculations based on $3.50 and it drops to $2.50 and stays there for 10 years, that's tough. So biofuels became tough, but I want to make the point that I have not studied biofuel markets. So I don't know, I'm not an expert at all, but what I saw just in that one project was there are conditions under which a biofuel project performs very well financially. And then there are conditions where it does not. And it's difficult to unshackle that relationship from the price of gasoline if you're making drop in gasoline, or the price of, some other fuel price or chemical. I'll leave you with this. A lot of people are thinking more and more about trying to make higher value products. Electricity is a pretty low value product. Diesel fuel or some of the lower grade fuel grades might be tough to compete. But if we can think about, chemicals and bioproducts, adhesives, all kinds of different things that are, we'll leave that to the chemists to figure out how to do that. If they can figure out how to do it efficiently, some of these projects that weren't viable 10 years ago might be viable now because of technological advances. One other thing I want to mention is, it is a huge enterprise to capitalize the type of biofuel industry that can put drop-in gasoline in an airplane or in someone's gas tank. And so I think aviation fuel is one that has gotten more and more traction. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the NARA project. And so that aviation fuel issue is still on the table and still moving forward and still gaining traction. So I think investigate that a little bit. But Mike, your point's a good one. I mean, there's a lot of places where there's been interest, but it never really pulled the trigger on a feasibility study. And so the idea here is, if the policy environment stabilizes and we have these incentives that are reducing that risk and increasing the revenue or increasing the financial outcomes, the financial return on investment, how can we get these going? So.
All right, so it looks like we've got 4 minutes left, and I have two questions, actually now 3 questions. So we'll try to run through them really fast. Otherwise, you have Nate's contact info. We will have time. We will have time actually when we go into the group discussion, that maybe we can have other questions come up. But Paul asked, especially for those of us who have worked on the west side, this meeting has highlighted some major differences between east side and west side forestry and forest issues. What you outlined in your presentation seems to fit east side forest more clearly. What issues and policies, policy parts pieces might fit the west side with its more productive forest, greater private lands, different wildfire regimes, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've spent a lot of my time in these kind of low value proposition environments. So I worked a lot on beetle kill forests in the Rocky Mountains, and as you described, kind of the east side stuff. But I think one of the things in those highly productive forests is the opportunity. If carbon gets monetized, the value associated with those forests for carbon sequestration, both in standing forest carbon, but don't forget the other part of the ecosystem, forest ecosystem. The forest carbon pool is the ecosystem pool in the soils and above ground biomass, but then the forest products pool. So I think making sure to be in a position to capitalize on opportunities if they arise is one area to focus. Trying to read the crystal ball and see how you can position yourself to capitalize on those things when they finally snap together. The other thing would be when we've already talked about this a little bit over the last couple of days, is predicting disturbances and getting ahead of the curve instead of behind the curve. And I say that in terms of also increasing the resistance to those forests, even though they're highly productive, increasing the resistance to potential future disturbances or climate effects. So those are 2 things that stand out.
Okay. All right. And Tom, since you've had your hand up longest, thanks for waiting. Tom. Oh, Thomas McGinley, you want to ask your question?
I was trying to unmute from my screen there. I kind of, we touched briefly yesterday on torrefaction. I was kind of wondering what your thoughts on that, and if that seems to be a viable, market for Eastern Oregon, since, we did put a plant up in Malheur Lumber.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's great. I think with the 50 seconds I have left, I'll just say that pyrolysis from torrefaction all the way to, we made biochars that were absolutely beautiful at, 1,000 Celsius and everything in between. This is a super confusing space. It's confusing on the product side. It's confusing on the market side. It's confusing on the technology side. And I think one of the things that I would do is focus on what's the project, what's the technology, what's the output, and then start to think about the markets in a kind of very compartmentalized way. So I think that particular project you're talking about did a good job of that, and I'd like to see other projects really dial in and focus on those details, because the gory details are where it's at.